My Mother at 66 by Kamala. Driving from my parents' home to Cochin last Friday morning, I saw my mother beside me, doze, open-mouthed, her face ashen like that of a corpse, and realized with pain that she was as old as she looked.
Indian poetry in English. Kamala is truly a representative. We are looking at My Mother at 66 by Kamala. But do you realize when the Indian poetry in English really began? This was around the 1860s, 1870s, alright? So we're going back to that period which many critics, sociologists and thinkers like to refer to as the period of the Indian Renaissance. And among the important poets of that period were the Dutt sisters, Aru Dutt, Toru Dutt. They all wrote poetry in English. I'm talking about the 1870s, but they wrote in clear imitation of the Romantic poets. The Romantic poets, the Romantic age in English literature was over 50 years ago. But we were, remember, in the colonial period. And so these poets wrote beautiful nature poetry about nature in India, but in the style imitating the Romantic poets. And from there, we've come a long way to the 20th century when we speak about poets like Sarojini Naidu and, of course, our poet of the day, Kamala. Kamala was a bilingual poet. Born in 1934, she died in 2009. Kamala Suraya was her name. She also wrote under the pen name of Madhavi Kutty. She was an iconoclast in many ways. What does that mean? She wanted to break the accepted traditions of society, of Indian society. She wrote her autobiography, which she called My Story. She wrote poems and short stories, both in English and in Malayalam. A lot of criticism she had to face was because she believed in openly writing about female sexuality, which was still not very accepted during the period in which she wrote. Her poem and introduction can be considered what I would call an absolute example of the kind of poetry that Kamala wrote. Since her poems have been translated from Malayalam to English too, sometimes you could see how she writes differently in Malayalam and how she writes in English. Winner of many awards, she's quite a popular poet when it comes to youngsters and also a part of syllabi across school boards and universities in our country. The poem today is My Mother at 66. My Mother at 66. Each one of us, when we think of our mothers, whatever their age may be, we look at them differently because they are our mothers. And many of you might have mothers who are much younger than 66. Some of us have our mothers older than 66. But what does Kamala say about her mother in My Mother at 66? Where are they when her thoughts begin? The poem begins with, driving from my parents' home to Cochin last Friday morning, I saw my mother doze, open-mouthed, her face ashen like that of a corpse, and realized with pain that she was as old as she looked. And it goes on. You know, there aren't too many punctuations. But I want to tell you, her mother, as Kamala, as the poet looks at her now, as she describes her in this poem, is not a beautiful mother. The mother is 66 and she's dozing in the car. They are on their way to Cochin airport. So obviously somebody is leaving. And no marks for guessing. Kamala Das is driving the car and her mother is sleeping. So obviously dozing, not really sleeping. So obviously she's probably going to see off her mother. And then she talks about the mother-daughter relationship. The poem is not only about mother-daughter relationship. I think it's also about all relationships. Or should I put it differently and say it's about familial relationships. Relationships within a family. And you would agree with me that when we are younger, probably these relationships are very simple. But as we grow older, there is a complexity that seeps in. You could call it the generation gap. You could call it pulling in different directions. You could call it the old versus the new. Call it what you will. But there is certainly a complex relationship that grows. And the older we get, the more complex it is. So her mother is 66. Maybe not very old. But as Kamala Das looks at her, she also begins to imagine that she would lose her mother at some day. 10 years, 20 years later, but her mother is no longer young. And then the contrast. This is what great poetry is about. Remember, they are in a moving car. They are going towards the airport. So she looks out, and what does she see? She calls them young trees. So there are trees, and the trees are sprinting. All of us have had the experience of being in a moving train. And we always get the feeling that it is the trees which are rushing by, as if we are stationary. You know, this is something which we have all seen, which we have all experienced, and which we all love probably. So here she is sitting inside a car with her old mother, and she looks outside, and she looks at the sprinting trees outside. The comparison between the mother and the young trees. And then they reach the airport. What happens at the airport? You have the security check. The mother passes through the security check, and Kamala Das can't help look again at her mother. And she thinks her mother is pale. And then she wonders whether this is going to be the last time that she will be seeing Amma. And then she says, I smiled. Why did she smile? Anyone's guess is as good as the other. As one looks at the poem, I think what strikes us first is that there is no rhyme scheme. In fact, there's no margin at the right, if you know what I mean. Because usually poems have a kind of a meter, and therefore each line is as long or as short as the previous line. But here, there's nothing like that. Because it's a kind of reminiscing, I think, and therefore it's as if she's talking. So that is one important thing we notice about this poem. Yes, the simile, as I've told you in many a time, is the most common figure of speech. So here you have her mother being compared to a corpse, almost as if she's looking at the dead mother or at the dead body of the mother. That is how the simile hits us almost right at the beginning of the poem. Poets believe in symbolism. You know, when one object stands for something else, and therefore here you have the pale moon, winter moon, probably a kind of indication of decay, because death is in a way a decay also. And then you have personification. Remember the trees sprinting by? I talked about how it seems as if we are stationary and the trees are running by. So there you have personification. The human quality of sprinting being given to an inanimate object, the trees. Somebody might say not inanimate, shall I say non-human object. And then we have repetition. You know, repetition is used because the poet wants to emphasize. And remember, the poem ends with, and smile, and smile, and smile. Again, if you look at sound-related figures of speech, we've got the consonants, the repetition of a consonant sound. and therefore you have security check standby. And then you have assonance, which is the repetition of the vowel sound. The vowel sound O. I'm giving you a test. You have to check in which line you can find that. Seemingly a simple poem, but not so simple when you look at all these layers of meaning that the poet is able to convey because of the use of these literary devices. Read the poem again and look at all these figures of speech, and maybe you could identify even some more which I've not talked about. My mother at 66. Have you read any other poems on the mother? The mother, the father, siblings, my friend. So many poems about these relationships which give meaning to our life. Look for such poems, read them, and see whether they fill you with a sense of optimism, a hope, a looking forward to, or do they fill you with a sense of loss. I would even suggest reading a poems like what are called the Lucy poems. She grew up in the lap of nature, so you could read that too. And why not read some poems by Kamala to let us know how different she was from many of the other poets of that period. Remember, this is Indian poetry in English, which is certainly different from other English poets who write from other different parts of the world.
But soon put that thought away and looked out at young trees sprinting, the merry children spilling out of their homes. But after the airport security check, standing a few yards away, I looked again at her, wan, pale as a late winter's moon, and felt that old familiar ache. My childhood's fear. But all I said was, "See you soon, Amma." All I did was smile and smile and smile.